At Iron Harbor Medical Center in Seattle, Nurse Mia Callahan carries scars that her coworkers turn into cruel jokes and quiet mockery. None of them know what those marks truly mean. Dr. Caleb Sterling, arrogant and obsessed with his reputation, makes a point of humiliating her in front of everyone, treating her as weak and disposable. Everything changes when a convoy of armored SUVs arrives at the hospital, carrying a critically wounded operator, a Navy SEAL named Mason, bleeding out from a wound that will kill him in minutes. While the doctors hesitate, Mia's hands stop shaking. She knows exactly what to do, and viewers will learn, right alongside the story, a real hemorrhage control technique that can save a life. When the team leader, Bishop, realizes exactly who is standing in front of him, he does something no one in that hospital ever expected to see. If this story pulls you in, hit like, subscribe to Silent Badges Stories, and drop a comment telling us who you think Mia really is, because the truth is coming, and it changes everything. The tray hit the floor before Mia Callahan even understood why her hands had gone cold. Dr. Caleb Sterling stood over her with his arms crossed, his white coat pressed and perfect, his voice pitched just loud enough for the entire nurses' station to hear. "I asked for the chart 3 minutes ago," he said. "Do you understand English, or should I write it down in crayon for you?" A few nurses near the supply closet laughed, quickly, nervously, the kind of laugh people give when they want to belong to the person doing the humiliating instead of the one receiving it. Mia bent down and picked up the tray. Her fingers, thin, scarred fingers that carried a story nobody at Iron Harbor Medical Center had ever bothered to ask about, gathered the scattered gauze and syringes without a single word. "I am getting it now, Dr. Sterling," she said quietly. "Getting it now," he repeated, mimicking her voice in a tone that made 2 more nurses giggle. "You know, Mia, I have met golden retrievers with faster response times." He turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the tile with the confidence of a man who had never once been told no. Mia stood alone at the station, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and pulled her sleeve down over the pale scar that ran along her right forearm. It was an old habit. Cover the mark, cover the question before anyone can ask it. A small voice pulled her attention toward the pediatric hallway. A boy of about 7, admitted overnight for a bad asthma flare, stood gripping the frame of his door, his oxygen line trailing behind him like a leash he had outgrown. "Nurse Mia," he said. "I heard yelling." "That was nothing important, Tommy," she said, kneeling down to his height, her voice softening into something warm and unhurried. "Doctors like the sound of their own voice sometimes. It does not mean anything happened." "He is mean to you." "He is mean to everyone," Mia said, smiling. "That is not the same as being right about anything." Tommy considered this with the serious face only children give to matters they have decided are important. "My dad says you are the only one who listens when I say my chest feels tight before the machine even beeps." "That is because I am always listening," Mia said, and helped him back toward his bed, tucking the blanket with the same steady hands that in a few short hours would be packing a wound most nurses would never be trained to touch. It was a small moment, the kind nobody wrote incident reports about, the kind that never reached Sterling's ears or the administration's quarterly review. But it was the moment, if anyone had been paying attention, that revealed the truest thing about Mia Callahan. Underneath the silence, underneath the lowered eyes and the sleeves pulled down over old scars, there was a person who had once been trained to protect people, and had never actually stopped, not for one single day since she traded a call sign for a name tag. She had been at Iron Harbor for 14 months. In that time, she had learned the exact rhythm of the place, the exact sound Dr. Sterling made when he wanted an audience, the exact spot by the elevator where the newer nurses gathered to whisper about the quiet woman with the scars nobody explained. They called her strange behind her back. They called her jumpy. Once, in the break room, a resident named Patricia had joked that Mia probably got those scars falling off a bicycle, and the room had laughed, and Mia had smiled along with them, because it was easier than telling the truth, and because the truth was not hers to give away in a break room over stale coffee. Nobody at Iron Harbor knew that the scar above her left eyebrow had come from a doorframe in a compound outside Kandahar. Nobody knew that the faint lines across her knuckles had come from years of training that most human bodies were never meant to survive. Nobody knew that the small tattoo hidden beneath her collarbone, a single black feather no bigger than a thumbprint, had been given to her by 6 people who no longer spoke her old name out loud, because speaking it meant remembering the ones who did not come home. 6 years ago, she had answered to a different name entirely, a call sign given to her the week she completed a selection course that broke 14 of the 16 people who started it. Raven. It had meant something once. Whispered over radios in places whose names never made it into newspapers. Spoken by men who trusted her hands with their lives without a second thought. Now it was a word she kept locked in a drawer with an old dog tag and a folded flag, buried under sweaters in a closet she rarely opened. She had left that world quietly, without ceremony. 3 months after a mission in a valley, she still saw sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking. She had wanted an ordinary life, a life where nobody needed her to be fast, or lethal, or unbreakable. Nursing school had felt like the safest possible distance from everything she used to be. A profession built entirely around gentleness, around bedside manner, around the kind of care that never once required a weapon. She had not expected gentleness to come with its own particular cruelty. She had not expected to trade bullets for whispers, or danger for the slow daily erosion of being underestimated by men who had never once had to prove themselves under fire. At Iron Harbor, she was simply Mia, small, quiet, slow to speak, the nurse who flinched when doors slammed, the one who kept her sleeves down in July. She finished restocking the tray and moved down the hallway, past the pediatric wing, past the vending machines, past the window that looked out over the ambulance bay where rain slid sideways in gray sheets against the glass. Seattle had been drowning in storm clouds for 3 days straight, and the emergency room had been slammed with car accidents, hypothermia cases, a man who had fallen off a roof trying to fix a gutter in the wind. At the nurse's station, a younger nurse named Priya caught up with her, matching her stride, glancing back once to make sure Sterling was out of earshot. "You do not have to let him talk to you like that," Priya said. "I could file a complaint with HR. Half the floor would back me up." "It would not change anything," Mia said. "Men like Sterling do not get corrected. They get promoted, and everyone around them learns to duck." "That is bleak." "That is Tuesday," Mia said, and something almost like a smile crossed her face, quick and dry, gone before it fully arrived. Priya studied her for a moment. "You never get angry. I do not understand how you do that. If someone spoke to me like that every single day, I would have quit or snapped a long time ago." "I get angry," Mia said quietly. "I just learned a long time ago that anger is only useful when it is aimed at the right target, at the right moment. Wasting it on a man like Sterling would be like emptying a magazine at a target that is not even worth the ammunition." Priya laughed, assuming it was a joke. Mia did not correct her. Mia liked the noise of a busy floor. It gave her something to disappear into. She did not know, as she checked vitals on a woman in Bay 4, that in exactly 11 minutes, 3 black SUVs would come tearing off the highway exit and into the ambulance bay, moving faster than any civilian vehicle had any right to move, tires throwing up sheets of water, doors opening before the engines had fully stopped. She did not know that the next 15 minutes would end 14 months of hiding. At the morning staff meeting, Sterling had made a point of holding up a printed schedule and announcing, to the room, that certain staff members needed to be reminded that punctuality was not optional, his eyes settling on Mia even though she had clocked in 6 minutes early. Nobody corrected him. Correcting Sterling in front of an audience was its own kind of career risk, and everyone on that floor understood the arithmetic of survival inside a hospital hierarchy that protected its most senior doctors long before it protected the nurses who kept the entire building functioning. Mia had said nothing. She had learned, in a different kind of hierarchy entirely, that silence was sometimes the most disciplined weapon available. Soldiers who reacted to every provocation did not survive long enough to matter. Neither, she suspected, did nurses. Dr. Sterling found her again near the med cart, holding a tablet like a weapon. "You transposed a dosage on Mr. Alvarez's chart," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Do you know what happens when nurses who cannot read a decimal point are allowed anywhere near patients?" "I did not transpose anything," Mia said. Her voice stayed level, but something behind her eyes went very still, the way water goes still right before it turns to ice. "I entered 0.5 milligrams. If the chart says 5 milligrams, someone changed it after I signed off." "Are you accusing me of falsifying a chart?" "I am telling you what I entered." Sterling stepped closer, close enough that 2 passing residents slowed down to watch, close enough that Mia could smell his cologne, expensive, sharp, designed to announce a room before he entered it. You are a replaceable pair of hands in scrubs, he said quietly enough that only she could hear it now. There are 40 nurses on a waiting list who would take your position tomorrow. Remember that the next time you decide to argue with a doctor in front of my staff. He walked away before she could answer, which was, Mia understood, exactly the point. Men like Sterling never wanted an answer. They wanted the silence after, the silence that let them believe they had won something. Mia pressed her palm flat against the cool metal of the medcart until the shaking in her fingers stopped. It always stopped. It always had. Ever since the desert. Ever since the compound. Ever since the night that took the tattoo's meaning from a memory into a debt she carried on her skin. Outside, the rain kept falling. And then, at 2:47 in the afternoon, the ambulance bay doors blew open with a sound like a gunshot, and 3 armored SUVs skidded to a stop in the loading zone, and 6 men in tactical gear were pulling a 7th man out of the back seat, a big man, unconscious, his uniform soaked through with something darker and thicker than rainwater, pooling across the pavement in a widening black stain. "We need a trauma team now," one of them was screaming, a man with a scar through one eyebrow and eyes like flint. "He is bleeding out! Move! Move! Move!" Every nurse on the floor froze for half a second, the half second where the brain tries to process a scene too violent for a Tuesday afternoon. Security guards near the entrance reached for radios, unsure whether to treat the armed, tactically dressed men as a threat or as an emergency. Somewhere behind the front desk, a receptionist knocked over a cup of coffee and did not stop to clean it. The automatic doors kept trying to close against the rain, and the bodies moving through them, buzzing an alarm that nobody had time to silence. The wounded man was enormous, easily 6'3", even limp and unconscious, blood soaking through the leg of his uniform in a spreading dark bloom that had already reached his boot. 2 of the tactical men carried him between them in a fireman-style grip, while a third pressed both hands uselessly against the wound, his palms already slick and red, his face pale with the particular fear of a warrior who can fight anything except the mathematics of blood loss. Mia did not freeze. Her feet were already moving before her mind caught up to them, moving toward the doors, toward the blood, toward a language of pressure points and femoral arteries that she had not spoken out loud in 6 years, but had never, not for one single day, forgotten. The wounded man's name, stitched onto a torn strip of uniform, read Mason. He had been shot through the upper thigh, high and close to the groin, in the exact place where an artery ran wide and unforgiving, the exact place where a person could lose enough blood to die in under 3 minutes if nobody knew precisely what to do. Doctors at Iron Harbor did know how to manage gunshot wounds in general, but general knowledge and split-second battlefield instinct are not the same animal. And for 4 long seconds, as Mason was wheeled through the trauma bay doors, the attending physician on shift hesitated, calling for imaging, calling for a surgical consult, calling for things that took minutes Mason did not have. Mia shoved past 2 orderlies and a nursing student frozen against the wall. "Direct pressure is not enough," she said, her voice suddenly sharp, suddenly commanding in a way nobody at Iron Harbor had ever heard from her. "That wound is too high for a standard tourniquet placement. I need a junctional device or I'm packing it by hand right now." The attending physician, a tired man named Dr. Okafor who had never once mocked her the way Sterling did, looked at her with something between confusion and desperate hope. "Callahan, what are you talking about? There is no junctional kit on this floor." "Then get me hemostatic gauze and get out of my way." Nobody moved for a heartbeat, so Mia moved instead, snapping on gloves, kneeling into the blood without a flicker of hesitation, her hands finally, doing the one thing they had been trained across years and continents to do, without asking her permission first. A nursing student named Dana stood frozen against the wall, gauze packs spilling from her trembling hands, tears already starting at the edges of her eyes. "I do not know what to do," Dana whispered. "There is so much blood. I have never seen this much blood." "Look at me," Mia said, not unkindly, without ever taking her eyes off the wound. "Breathe first. Then hand me that entire roll of gauze, all of it. Do not count pieces, just give me the roll." Dana did as she was told, her hand steadying slightly under the calm authority in Mia's voice. "You are doing fine," Mia told her. "Panic is normal. Freezing is not useful. The difference between the two is deciding right now to move your hands anyway." It was, in its own small way, a kind of teaching that no textbook in Dana's program had ever offered her. The kind that only comes from someone who has knelt in blood before and lived to explain it calmly to someone else. This is the moment worth understanding clearly, because what Mia was doing to save Mason's life is something anyone watching this story could learn and use. When a wound occurs high on the thigh, near the groin, in what is called a junctional area, a standard limb tourniquet cannot be applied because there is no single point above the wound to tighten around. This is one of the most lethal injury locations in trauma medicine, responsible for a significant share of preventable battlefield and civilian deaths, because bleeding here can empty a person's blood volume in a matter of minutes. The femoral artery runs directly through this region, carrying an enormous volume of blood to the leg with every heartbeat. In these situations, the technique Mia used is called wound packing, combined with direct, sustained manual pressure. She pressed clean, sterile gauze directly into the wound tract itself, not simply over the surface of the skin, packing it firmly and deliberately down to the source of the bleeding, layer after layer, using her body weight through the heel of her hand to hold continuous pressure directly against the point where the artery had been damaged. This method works because it compresses the bleeding vessel against the surrounding bone and tissue, physically restricting blood flow at its source rather than simply covering the wound. Hemostatic gauze, treated with an agent that accelerates clotting, makes this dramatically more effective, but the packing technique itself, applied with unwavering, unrelenting pressure, held in place for several full minutes without lifting or checking, is what actually keeps a person alive long enough to reach surgery. It requires calm hands, exact anatomical knowledge, and the discipline to hold pressure even when it feels like nothing is happening, because letting go too early to check the wound can undo every second already invested. For anyone watching at home wondering why she did not simply grab the nearest tourniquet, the answer matters. A standard limb tourniquet needs a full loop around a limb, tightened above the wound, cutting off blood flow between the heart and the injury. In a junctional wound, there is no room above the injury to place that loop, because the injury sits at the point where the leg joins the body. This is exactly why junctional wounds are so feared in trauma medicine, and exactly why packing and sustained pressure, uncomfortable and exhausting as it is to hold, remains one of the most important skills a first responder or bystander can ever learn. Community first aid courses across the country now teach exactly this technique, using training gauze on mannequins, precisely because ordinary people, not just soldiers or trauma surgeons, have used it in real emergencies to keep someone alive until paramedics arrived. The room around Mia had gone almost reverently quiet, the kind of silence that falls over people watching a skill they do not fully understand, but instinctively recognize as real. Mason's blood pressure, read aloud by a monitor tech in a shaking voice, had dropped low enough to kill him twice over. Mia did not look up at the number. She kept her hands buried in the wound, counting silently, feeling the wet heat against her palms, feeling 6 years of a life she had buried under scrubs, and silence come roaring back into her fingers like something that had never actually left. "Pressure is holding," she said out loud, to Okafor, to the room, to herself. "Get me 2 units, O negative now, and prep for junctional clamp if we have anything close to one in this building." Dr. Okafor knelt beside her, watching her hands work with an unmistakable, practiced economy of motion. No wasted gestures, no hesitation, no second-guessing. "Callahan," he said under his breath, "I have worked trauma for 11 years. I have never seen anyone move like that outside of a documentary about combat medicine." "Focus on the surgical prep," Mia said. "I have this." He did focus, because there was nothing else useful to do, because the wound was slowing its bleed exactly the way she had promised it would, because whatever question he wanted to ask could wait until Mason was no longer actively dying on the table in front of them. Behind her, the man with the scarred eyebrow, the one who had been screaming in the ambulance bay, went suddenly and completely silent. He was staring at her hands. His name was Bishop, and he had led men through 11 combat deployments across 3 different continents. He had watched medics work on the dying more times than he could count on both hands. In mud, in sand, in the back of moving vehicles under fire. He had never, not once, seen a hospital nurse pack a junctional wound with that particular grip, that particular rhythm of pressure and release, that particular stillness in the shoulders that only comes from training so deep it lives below conscious thought. "Where did you learn that?" Bishop said. It was not really a question. His voice had dropped to something low and careful, the voice of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the room he was standing in, Mia did not look up. Medical school, she said. No, Bishop said. It is not. I have seen combat medics do exactly what you just did. Exactly. That is not a technique they teach in nursing programs. Around them, the trauma bay had gone strange and quiet, doctors and nurses pretending to be busy while straining to listen, aware that something was happening that none of them had a name for yet. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, his expression already curdling into something dismissive when he saw Mia kneeling in blood, giving orders, being obeyed. Callahan, step aside. Let Dr. Okafor handle this, Sterling said, stepping forward with the easy authority of a man used to being listened to. If she steps aside, your patient dies, Bishop said without turning around. She stays exactly where she is. Sterling opened his mouth to argue, looked at the SEAL's face and closed it again. Mia held pressure for 4 more minutes while a surgical team scrambled into place. 4 minutes that felt like 4 hours. 4 minutes where nobody in that trauma bay breathed easily until the surgeon finally arrived and Mia guided his hands, actual words, actual instructions, to the exact point of the bleed. Junctional compression, superior to the wound tract. He needs a Foley catheter balloon technique if you do not have a proper junctional tourniquet. Inflate it inside the tract for internal pressure, she said. And the surgeon, a woman named Dr. Reyes, who had spent 2 tours in combat hospitals before coming to Iron Harbor, looked at Mia with an expression of pure, startled recognition. Who are you? Dr. Reyes said quietly. Mia did not answer. She stepped back from the table, only when 4 hands replaced her 2, only when Mason's vitals steadied, only when the immediate danger had passed into the slower, more manageable danger of surgery and recovery. She stripped off her gloves. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were not shaking anymore. Dr. Reyes caught up with her at the scrub sink, pulling off her own gloves with quick, efficient movements, studying Mia with the particular focus of someone recognizing a fellow survivor of something most people never had to survive. I did 2 tours at a combat support hospital in Helmand before I came here, Reyes said quietly. I have seen exactly 3 people in my life move like that around a junctional wound. 2 of them were Army Special Forces medics. The 3rd one just walked out of my operating room. I do not know what you think you saw, Mia said. I know exactly what I saw, Reyes said, not unkindly. Whatever you are protecting, Callahan. I am not interested in exposing it. I am interested in knowing whether you would ever consider training the rest of this trauma staff. Because what you just did should be standard practice in this hospital, and it is not, and that gap almost cost that man his life. Mia said nothing, but something in her chest loosened slightly, a small unfamiliar ease at being seen, without being punished for it. Near the nurse's station, Dr. Sterling stood watching the scene with an expression that had curdled from irritation into something colder and more calculating. He had spent 14 months building a comfortable hierarchy in which Mia Callahan occupied the very bottom rung, useful for humiliation, invisible for anything else. Watching a Navy SEAL defer to her instructions in front of the entire trauma floor had rearranged something in him that he did not yet know how to name. And men like Sterling, when their understanding of the world is rearranged without their permission, rarely respond with grace. He turned and walked toward the administrative wing without a word, already composing, in the careful architecture of his mind, the version of this afternoon he intended to report to the hospital director. One of Bishop's men, a lanky operator with a gap-toothed grin who had introduced himself earlier as Wolf, leaned against the hallway wall, trying and failing to look casual. So, just to confirm, Wolf said, the tiny nurse who has been getting yelled at by pretty boy in the white coat all day just saved Mason's life using a technique they teach at the schoolhouse. That is the situation we are in right now. That is the situation, Bishop said. Cool, totally normal Tuesday, Wolf said, then glanced at Mia with an expression somewhere between awe and genuine amusement. Ma'am, no offense, but you have the most terrifying resting nurse face I have ever seen on a human being. I almost handed you my sidearm. Despite everything, despite the adrenaline and the rain, and 14 months of careful invisibility cracking apart in real time, Mia felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. I would not have taken it, she said. Hospital policy. Wolf laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him by the dry delivery, and even Bishop allowed himself a brief, Tired smile before his expression settled back into something more serious. Bishop followed Mia into the hallway. "You never looked at me," he said, his voice quiet now, almost gentle. "You only looked down, this whole time. Every time I have been in this hospital before, dropping off wounded men, you looked down and disappeared into a corner." Mia stopped walking. She did not turn around. "I did not want to be looked at," she said. "Those are not a nurse's hands," Bishop said. "That is battlefield training. I do not know who you are, Mia Callahan, but I know exactly what you are, and I intend to find out why you have been hiding it in a hospital in Seattle." "I am not hiding anything," Mia said, though even to her own ears the words sounded thin. "6 of my men are alive today because somebody, somewhere, trained a person exactly like you," Bishop said. "I do not need your file number or your old unit designation to know that. I have spent my whole career around operators, Callahan. I know what one looks like even when she is wearing scrubs and keeping her eyes on the floor." "It is Mia," she said. "Just Mia. That other person does not exist anymore." Bishop looked at her for a long moment, rain still dripping off the shoulders of his jacket, the ambulance bay lights flashing red and white behind him through the glass doors. "Whoever you used to be," he said quietly. "She just saved one of the best men I have ever served with. I do not think she is as gone as you want her to be." He walked back toward the trauma bay, leaving Mia alone in the hallway with the sound of rain against glass and the fading adrenaline still humming beneath her skin. Down the corridor, in an office with a view of the parking garage, Hospital Director Warren Talbot listened to Dr. Sterling's version of the afternoon with growing unease, his pen tapping an uneven rhythm against a legal pad already filling with concerned, cautious language. Words like unauthorized medical intervention, words like scope of practice violation, words like liability exposure. Talbot did not yet know what to make of a nurse who apparently possessed skills far outside her documented training, skills that had, undeniably, saved a patient's life. He only knew that Iron Harbor Medical Center had rules, and rules that got bent in public, in front of witnesses, in front of armed federal personnel, had a way of becoming problems that outlived the emergency that created them. "I want a full incident report on my desk by morning," Talbot said, "and I want to know exactly who Mia Callahan really is." Sterling nodded, already imagining the version of the story where he emerged as the reasonable voice of caution, the one who had raised concerns while everyone else lost their heads over a nurse with an unexplained skill set. It never occurred to him that the truth, once it finally surfaced, would not be kind to the story he was building. Behind them, through the trauma bay doors, Mason's monitor beeped in a steady, surviving rhythm, and Mia Callahan stood very still in the hallway, feeling 14 months of careful invisibility begin, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart. By morning, the story of what happened in the trauma bay had traveled through every floor of Iron Harbor Medical Center, changing shape with each retelling the way stories always do inside a hospital that runs on gossip and exhaustion in equal measure. In the cafeteria, an orderly swore he had heard she was former CIA. In radiology, a technician insisted she had once been a war correspondent who picked up field medicine by accident. By the time the story reached the billing department on the 3rd floor, someone was convinced Mia had personally carried Mason out of a burning building on her back before the SUVs had even arrived, which was, as far as anyone could tell, not remotely true, but made for an excellent story over lukewarm break-room coffee. Mia ignored all of it. She had spent 6 years learning to let rumors pass through a room without needing to correct them, the same way she had learned to let insults pass through a room without needing to answer them. What she could not ignore, however, was the tightness building in her chest as she approached the locker room and saw Director Talbot waiting, his expression carefully arranged into something between concern and obligation. Mia arrived for her shift to find Director Talbot waiting for her outside the locker room, flanked by a woman from Human Resources holding a folder thick enough to suggest weeks of preparation crammed into a single overnight. "Ms. Callahan," Talbot said, his tone carefully neutral in the way of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in front of a mirror. "We need to discuss yesterday's incident." "Mason is alive," Mia said. "I would call that a successful outcome, not an incident. You performed an unauthorized medical intervention that falls well outside the documented scope of a registered nurse," Talbot said, opening the folder as though the paper inside carried more authority than the man reciting it. "Wound packing at that depth, verbal direction to a surgeon regarding balloon catheter technique. These are not nursing actions. We have a legal obligation to investigate where you acquired this training and whether your credentials accurately reflect your actual background. I saved his life within the standard of care for catastrophic hemorrhage, Mia said, her voice even, controlled, betraying nothing of the tightening in her chest. If Dr. Reyes and Dr. Okafor are willing to attest to that, I do not see what investigation is required. They already have, the HR woman said quietly, not unkindly. Her name tag read, Grace Whitfield, and something in her tone suggested she was not entirely comfortable with the role she had been assigned in this meeting. Both physicians filed statements in your defense within an hour of the incident. That is not the concern that brought us here. Then what is the concern? Mia asked. Whitfield glanced at Talbot before answering. The concern is optics, liability, and a credentials file that does not match observed behavior. In plain terms, Ms. Callahan, either you are lying about your background on your employment application, which is a terminable offense, or the hospital has been operating for 14 months without accurate information about an employee's actual qualifications, which is a regulatory nightmare. Neither option is comfortable for this institution. There is a third option, Mia said quietly. Which is? That my documented qualifications as a registered nurse are entirely accurate, and I simply possess additional training this hospital never asked about, because it never occurred to anyone here that a quiet woman who kept her eyes down might have a life before Iron Harbor worth asking about. The room went still for a moment. Whitfield looked briefly, almost embarrassed. Talbot closed the folder. The concern, Ms. Callahan, is that your personnel file lists 11 months of prior nursing experience at a small clinic in Ohio before you were hired here. Nothing in that file explains how a person with 11 months of general nursing experience performs battlefield trauma technique with the precision of a combat medic with a decade of field time. Either your file is incomplete, or it is inaccurate, and either possibility is a problem for this hospital's liability position. Mia said nothing. There was, she understood, no version of the truth she could offer that would simplify this moment, rather than complicate it further. Pending review, you are suspended from patient-facing duties, Talbot said. Administrative leave, paid, effective immediately. I am sorry it has come to this, but I have a hospital to protect. Whitfield slid a copy of the suspension paperwork across the counter toward her, pen already clipped to the top page. You are entitled to appeal within 10 business days. I would encourage you to consider it, Ms. Callahan. For what it is worth, I do not think this outcome is fair, but fairness is not always the same thing as policy. I understand the distinction, Mia said, signing the paperwork with a steady hand that gave away nothing of the storm building underneath her calm exterior. I have spent most of my adult life inside institutions that valued policy over fairness. This will not be the first time I have had to wait for the truth to catch up with the rules. Dr. Sterling, positioned conveniently within earshot near the supply closet, allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile Mia had ever seen cross his face. She turned and walked out of the building without another word, past nurses who would not meet her eyes, past Priya who mouthed, "I am sorry," silently from across the hall, past the ambulance bay where, only 18 hours earlier, she had knelt in a stranger's blood and finally, briefly, been exactly who she used to be. Tommy waved at her weakly from his hospital bed as she passed his open door, his oxygen line still trailing behind him, unaware of the storm unfolding around the nurse who always listened when his chest felt tight, before the machines even noticed. "Are you leaving?" he asked. "Just for a little while," Mia said, forcing warmth into her voice that she did not entirely feel. "I will be back before you know it." "Promise?" "I promise," she said, and meant it more fiercely than she expected to. A small, sturdy vow that steadied something inside her chest as she continued down the hallway. Outside, in the parking garage, Bishop was waiting beside a black SUV, arms crossed, rain finally beginning to ease into a thin gray drizzle. "I heard," he said. "News travels fast." "Wolf has been sitting in that stairwell eavesdropping on hospital gossip for 2 hours," Bishop said. "He has apparently made friends with 3 separate nursing students. I do not fully understand how he does that." Despite everything, Mia felt something loosen in her chest, some small release of pressure at the absurdity of it. "Your team has a strange set of skills." "You would know," Bishop said. "I looked into some things last night. Not your current file. The other one. The one buried 3 systems deep that took me most of the night, and 2 favors I am not proud of calling in. Mia went very still. I am not here to expose you, Bishop said, reading the tension in her shoulders correctly. I am here because Mason is going to need weeks of recovery, and I would trust exactly one person in this city to manage it properly, and that hospital just suspended her over paperwork instead of thanking her. What do you want, Bishop? I want you to help me get Mason through the next 72 hours without complications, off the books if necessary, Bishop said. And I want you to think seriously about whether hiding inside a job that punishes you for excellence is actually the peace you thought you were building for yourself. He leaned against the SUV, rain darkening the shoulders of his jacket. I read the after-action report from your last deployment, the one where your team pulled 11 wounded operators out of a compound under sustained fire before extraction arrived. Every single one of them survived contact. Every single one. In this line of work, Callahan, that number does not happen by accident. That number happens because someone in that room refused to let it happen any other way. That was a long time ago, Mia said. It was 6 years ago, Bishop said, which, in this line of work, might as well be yesterday. People do not forget medics like you. They tell stories about medics like you for the rest of their careers, usually without ever knowing your actual name, just the call sign and the numbers that do not make sense unless you were there. I did not come here to be a legend, Bishop. I came here to disappear. I understand that better than you think, Bishop said, quieter now. I have buried enough friends to understand exactly why a person might want to disappear. But disappearing and hiding are not the same thing, Callahan. Disappearing is choosing peace. Hiding is choosing fear, and dressing it up so it looks like peace from a distance. I think you already know which one you have actually been doing for 14 months. Mia did not answer immediately. The rain continued falling, softer now, and somewhere above them, through the concrete ceiling of the parking garage, the hospital continued its quiet daily rhythm of small emergencies and small kindnesses, entirely unaware of the conversation happening in its shadow. I will help with Mason, she said finally. Not because you convinced me of anything, because he is a patient who needs care, and that has never stopped being what I do, suspension or not. Bishop nodded, accepting the deflection for what it was, choosing not to push further. That is enough for today. Rain continued to fall softly against the concrete of the parking garage, and Mia Callahan stood there for a long moment, caught between 2 versions of a life she had spent 6 years trying to keep separate. Bishop drove her to a private recovery suite 2 floors above the main hospital wing, arranged quietly through a contact in hospital administration, who owed him a favor from another life. Mason lay sedated but stable, monitors beeping their steady reassurance, his massive frame looking somehow smaller against the white hospital sheets. He lost his brother in the same valley where he took this wound, Bishop said quietly, standing beside Mia at the foot of the bed. Different deployment, 3 years apart, almost the exact same terrain. He has not said much about it, but I know it sits with him every time we roll out. Mia said nothing for a long moment, checking Mason's vitals with practiced hands, adjusting his IV line with the quiet competence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before in far worse conditions than a private hospital suite. Grief does not ask permission before it shows up again, she said finally. It just waits for a quiet moment and walks back in like it never left. You sound like you know that from experience. I buried 3 people I loved more than I have ever told anyone in this building, Mia said. I do not talk about them. Not because I do not carry them, but because talking about them out loud in a place like this feels like handing a piece of them to people who never got to know why they mattered. Bishop was quiet for a moment, watching her adjust the blanket over Mason's chest, with a tenderness that contradicted everything the hospital staff believed they knew about her. For what it is worth, he said, the ones we lose do not need us to talk about them to still matter. They just need us to keep doing the work they would have wanted us to keep doing. Mia looked up at him, something unguarded crossing her face for just a moment before she composed it again. That is the first genuinely comforting thing anyone has said to me in 14 months. I have my moments, Bishop said. And for the first time since the ambulance bay doors had blown open, something like a real, easy silence settled between them. The kind shared only by people who have both stood too close to the same kind of loss to need it explained. That night, A different kind of emergency arrived at Iron Harbor, one that had nothing to do with Mia's suspension, and everything to do with a storm system that had been building over the Pacific for 3 days. Mia had gone to a small motel 3 blocks from the hospital, rather than her apartment, unwilling to sit alone with her thoughts in a space that suddenly felt too quiet after 14 months of carefully maintained routine. She sat by the window, watching rain lash sideways against the glass, replaying the hearing in her mind, wondering whether staying invisible had ever actually protected her, or simply delayed an inevitable reckoning. The local news, playing quietly on a muted television bolted to the wall, showed a meteorologist tracking a dangerous band of wind moving inland off the coast, warning of possible power outages across the greater Seattle area through the night. Mia watched the radar swirl toward the hospital district with a low, unplaceable unease. The kind of instinct that had kept her alive more than once in places far more dangerous than a Pacific Northwest storm front. The wind hit first, a sustained gust that tore a transformer loose 2 blocks from the hospital, and then the lights in the ICU flickered once, twice, and died. The backup generator kicked in with a shuddering mechanical groan, but 30 seconds later it failed entirely, plunging the intensive care unit into a darkness broken only by the weak battery glow of a handful of portable monitors. Mia was in the parking garage when the alarm started, a distant, muffled shriek that carried even through concrete and rain. She did not think. She ran back toward the building, badge still in her pocket despite the suspension, because a suspension from paperwork meant nothing in the face of patients on ventilators losing power. Inside, chaos had already taken hold. Nurses moved through darkened hallways with flashlights clenched in their teeth, manually bagging patients whose ventilators had gone silent, voices rising with the particular controlled panic of professionals trying not to become the reason someone died tonight. An elderly patient near the window, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Ellison who had been fighting pneumonia for 6 days, gripped her daughter's hand in the darkness, her breathing shallow and frightened without the steady hum of her oxygen concentrator. "It is going to be okay, Mom," her daughter kept repeating, her voice cracking with the particular helplessness of someone with no medical training, watching machines go dark around someone they loved. Dana, the young nursing student Mia had guided through the trauma bay days earlier, moved into the room with a portable oxygen tank and a steadiness that would have surprised her a week ago. "Mrs. Ellison, I need you to breathe slow with me, in through your nose, count of 4, Dana said, kneeling by the bed, and for a moment, in the darkness, she looked very much like the nurse who had taught her to move her hands instead of freezing. "We have 4 vented patients on that floor, and the generator is not responding," a nurse named Carla shouted into a radio that only produced static in return. "Security says the backup transfer switch failed. We need facilities up here immediately." Mia arrived at the ICU doors already assessing the room the way she had once assessed compounds and corridors in another life entirely, cataloging exits, cataloging risk, cataloging the fastest path between a problem and its solution. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the darkness with an authority nobody questioned. "Suspension or not. Manual bagging on all 4 ventilated patients. Now, 1 nurse per patient, steady count. Do not rush and do not stop. Carla, get me every portable battery pack and pulse oximeter on this floor. Someone find facilities and tell them we need that transfer switch manually overridden in the next 4 minutes, or we start losing people." "The switch room is in the basement," a young orderly said, panic edging his voice. "Nobody can get down there fast enough in this." "I can," Mia said. "Where exactly is it?" Bishop, who had followed her back into the building against every instinct telling him to keep his team out of hospital business, fell into step beside her without being asked. "I am coming with you," he said. "I have run blackout extractions in worse conditions than a hospital basement." They moved together through stairwells lit only by emergency strips along the floor, down 4 flights into a basement that smelled of damp concrete and machine oil, following the young orderly's frantic directions toward a mechanical room, secured behind a door, that required a badge Mia no longer technically had clearance to use. "Move," Bishop said, and put his shoulder into the doorframe with the practiced economy of a man who had breached far more dangerous doors in his career. It gave on the second attempt. Inside, the transfer switch panel sat dark, a single indicator light blinking red where it should have shown green. Water had begun seeping under the door from a cracked drainage pipe somewhere overhead, pooling in a thin sheet across the concrete floor, close enough to the panel that Bishop instinctively reached to pull Mia back from the standing water. "Careful," he said, Water and live electrical panels do not mix. I know, Mia said, already assessing the panel with a calm, methodical focus, tracing the moisture line with her flashlight, before deciding it had not yet reached the critical components. We have maybe 90 seconds before that water reaches the relay housing. After that, this becomes a different kind of dangerous. She knelt in front of the panel, tracing wires with the flashlight clenched between her teeth, years of training in expedient field repairs under fire translating, with only minor adjustment, into the language of hospital infrastructure. The automatic transfer relay failed to engage, she said. I need to force it manually. Bishop, hold this light steady and do not let it move. Her hands worked quickly, calmly, bridging the failed automatic sequence with a manual override procedure she had learned in a country whose name she still did not say out loud. Adapting battlefield electrical knowledge to a hospital emergency panel with a focus that blocked out everything except the wires in front of her. The lights flickered, hesitated, and then flooded back on. First in the basement, then, moments later, radioing up through the building floor by floor as the ICU alarms shifted from panic to relief. Upstairs, 4 ventilated patients breathed steady again on machine power, their nurses sagging with exhausted gratitude against bed rails they had been gripping for 6 straight minutes of handbagging. In Mrs. Ellison's room, the oxygen concentrator whirred back to life with a soft mechanical sigh, and the elderly woman's shoulders sagged in visible relief as steady air filled her lungs again. Her daughter wept quietly into her mother's blanket, murmuring thanks to no one in particular, to whatever combination of luck and competence had kept the lights from staying dark long enough to matter. Dana found Mia in the hallway afterward, her scrubs soaked through with sweat and rain, her hands still faintly trembling from the adrenaline of the basement. You did that twice now, Dana said. Once with Mason. Now this. I do not understand how you stay so calm. I am not calm, Mia said. I am just quiet about being afraid. There is a difference, and it is a difference you can learn if you want to. I want to, Dana said, and meant it with the particular seriousness of someone who had just watched their own hands stop shaking for the first time under real pressure. Carla, the charge nurse who had been coordinating the manual bagging efforts, approached Mia with an expression of exhausted, grudging respect. Facilities is going to want a full report on how that switch got overridden without proper authorization. Tell them exactly what happened, Mia said. I do not have anything left to hide about tonight. Carla studied her for a long moment. For what it is worth, whatever they decide about your suspension, half this floor already knows you just saved 4 lives. You technically were not even cleared to be near. That is going to be hard for anyone to argue away. That is twice in 2 days you have saved lives that were not technically your responsibility, Bishop said as they climbed back up the stairwell. Somebody had to, Mia said simply. When they reached the ICU floor, Director Talbot was standing in the hallway, having arrived in the middle of the crisis, having watched, through the chaos, exactly who had solved the problem his own facilities team could not solve fast enough. He did not say anything immediately. He simply looked at Mia for a long moment. The folder from that morning nowhere in sight, and something in his expression had shifted from bureaucratic caution into something closer to reluctant, dawning respect. The formal hearing convened 3 days later in a conference room on the administrative floor. A room Mia had walked past 100 times without ever once being invited inside, its long table polished to a shine that reflected the gray Seattle light filtering through tall windows overlooking the parking garage where, days earlier, Bishop had first asked her to reconsider the piece she thought she had built. Talbot sat at the head of the table, Sterling seated with visible satisfaction near the door, already anticipating a verdict he considered a formality. Reyes and Okafor sat together at Mia's request, their statements printed and stapled in front of them, ready to be read into record if needed. Whitfield from Human Resources occupied a chair near the corner, her expression unreadable. And, unannounced and uninvited, Bishop stood quietly against the back wall in his dress uniform, ribbons and insignia catching the fluorescent light in a way that made the entire room sit up straighter the moment he walked in. Mia sat alone at the far end of the table, her hands folded in front of her, her sleeves rolled down out of habit rather than intention, waiting to learn whether 14 months of careful invisibility had been worth anything at all. This hearing is to determine Ms. Callahan's employment status following the incidents of this week, Talbot began. Dr. Sterling has formally requested termination on the grounds of unauthorized medical practice and credential misrepresentation. Sterling stood, straightening his coat with visible relish, This hospital has standards. Ms. Callahan has, by her own admission, performed procedures far outside her training. Procedures that, frankly, raise serious questions about who she actually is and what she is doing working under false pretenses in a civilian medical facility. Nobody has demonstrated false pretenses, Reyes interrupted, her voice sharp. You have demonstrated only that a nurse under your supervision possesses more skill than you were comfortable admitting existed on a floor you consider your personal territory, Dr. Sterling. Those are not the same accusation, and I would be careful conflating them in a formal hearing. With respect, Dr. Reyes, this is precisely the kind of defensiveness that allows dangerous precedent to take root in a hospital, Sterling said, color rising in his cheeks. If any nurse can simply perform unauthorized procedures whenever they personally decide it is warranted, we no longer have a functioning system of medical authority in this building. The system of medical authority in this building failed that patient for 4 full seconds while doctors called for imaging on a man who was actively bleeding to death, Okafor said quietly. I called those imaging orders myself, Dr. Sterling. In a moment of hesitation, I will regret for the rest of my career. Ms. Callahan corrected that failure in real time and saved a life that our normal protocol would have lost. I would like that officially recorded before this hearing proceeds any further. Talbot raised a hand for quiet. Duly noted, Dr. Okafor. Continue, Dr. Sterling, but I would ask you to address the actual credentialing question rather than general concerns about precedent. Before you continue, Bishop said quietly from the back of the room, I would like to be recognized. Talbot, aware of exactly whose uniform was standing in his conference room, nodded slowly. Go ahead, Commander. 3 days ago, Mia Callahan performed junctional wound packing on one of my men in your trauma bay, technique that kept him alive long enough to reach surgery, Bishop said. Last night, she manually overrode a failed transfer switch in your basement during a total power failure, saving 4 ventilated patients on this floor. I have spent 17 years around medical personnel in combat zones, and what she has done in the last 3 days exceeds the training of most special operations combat medics I have served beside. He paused, and the room went very still. Her name was not always Mia Callahan, Bishop continued. For 6 years, she served under the call sign Raven, attached to a joint special operations medical unit, whose casualty statistics I am not authorized to disclose in detail, except to say that unit is directly responsible for the survival of more operators than any comparable unit in the last decade. She left that career honorably, quietly, and by her own choice, to build a civilian life. I did not come here today to reveal secrets she wished kept private. I came here because a hospital that punishes competence this extraordinary, purely because it makes bureaucrats uncomfortable, does not deserve to keep her, and frankly, does not deserve the reputation she has been quietly protecting for 14 months. Sterling's face had gone through several colors during this speech, settling finally on a pale, uncertain white. That is an extraordinary claim. We have no way to verify. I can verify it, Dr. Reyes said. I recognized the technique the moment I saw it. I did not say anything because it was not my secret to reveal. But I will say this now, under oath if necessary. Whatever Mia Callahan used to be, she saved a man's life in my operating room using skill that no nursing program on Earth teaches. If this hospital fires her for that, it deserves every headline that follows. Okafor nodded beside her. I have 11 years of trauma experience. I learned something watching her work that I intend to teach every resident who rotates through my service from now on. Talbot looked around the room slowly, at Sterling's collapsing composure, at Reyes and Okafor's steady conviction, at Bishop's quiet, immovable certainty, and finally at Mia herself, sitting very straight, her hands folded on the table, the small scar above her eyebrow catching the light. Ms. Callahan, Talbot said, is what the commander said true? Mia was quiet for a long moment. 14 months of careful invisibility, of lowered eyes and covered scars, and silence swallowed instead of spoken, gathered behind her like a wave finally given permission to break. Yes, she said simply. My name was Raven. I served 6 years in a role I am not able to discuss in detail. I left because I wanted an ordinary life, not because I was running from anything I am ashamed of. I became a nurse because caring for people without a weapon in my hand felt like the truest version of peace I could imagine. I never lied about my competence. I simply never advertised where it came from because I did not think anyone here had earned the right to that story. She looked directly at Sterling. You called me replaceable. You called me a pair of hands in scrubs. I let you believe that because it was easier than explaining who I used to be to a man who has never once had to prove himself under real pressure. But I am not replaceable, Dr. Sterling, and neither is a single nurse on this floor who you have spent years humiliating in front of an audience that laughed because it was safer than defending them. The room was silent. Sterling opened his mouth and closed it again, finding, for the first time in 14 months, nothing sharp enough to say. Talbot closed the folder in front of him. This hearing is concluded. Ms. Callahan is reinstated to full duty, effective immediately, with a formal commendation added to her file for exceptional emergency response, twice in 1 week. Dr. Sterling, you and I will be having a separate conversation about workplace conduct standards at this hospital, a conversation I suspect is long overdue. Sterling left the room without a word. His posture, for the first time since Mia had known him, noticeably diminished. Talbot lingered after the others had filed out, closing the folder in front of him with a slow, deliberate motion. I owe you an apology, Ms. Callahan. I let concern about liability outweigh concern about doing right by a member of my staff. That is a failure of leadership on my part, and I intend to correct it, starting with a full review of how this hospital treats the people who keep it running, while doctors like Sterling take the credit for it. Apology accepted, Mia said, though I would rather see it in the policy than in the sentence, Director Talbot. Talbot allowed himself a small, tired smile. Fair enough. I will make sure it shows up in both. He gathered his papers and left, and for a long moment, Mia sat alone in the conference room, the stormlight through the tall windows catching dust motes drifting slowly above the polished table. 14 months of careful invisibility, finally, quietly, settling into something she no longer needed to carry alone. In the hallway afterward, Bishop found her by the window overlooking the ambulance bay, the storm finally clearing into pale afternoon light. Mason wants to see you before we transport him for continued rehab, Bishop said. He woke up an hour ago. First thing he asked was who packed his wound. Mia found Mason sitting up in his hospital bed, pale but alert, a tube still taped along his forearm, his eyes tracking her the moment she entered the room. They tell me a nurse saved my life, Mason said, his voice rough but steady. They also tell me that nurse used to be called Raven. Word travels fast around here, Mia said. I served with a medic once who trained under that call signs program, Mason said. Never met her personally. Heard stories, though. Heard she never lost a man in the field. Not once. Not in 6 years. Mia said nothing, but something in her chest, something she had held tightly closed for 6 years, eased slightly at hearing a truth spoken aloud by a stranger who had no reason to lie. Thank you, Mason said simply. Whatever name you are using these days. Get some rest, Mia said. You have a long recovery ahead of you, and I intend to make sure you do it properly. Mason smiled, the first real smile the room had seen from him. Understood, ma'am. Outside in the corridor, Bishop straightened to something close to attention as Mia walked out, an unmistakable, deliberate gesture of respect between operators, and one by one, the rest of his team, still lingering near the nurse's station, did the same, straightening, falling silent, offering the kind of recognition that needed no words at all. Priya, watching from the nurse's station, stared at the scene with wide eyes. Did a Navy SEAL just salute our nurse? Apparently, Dana said, still holding a chart she had forgotten she was carrying. Our nurse is not just our nurse. In the weeks that followed, Mia did not leave Iron Harbor Medical Center. She could have. Bishop had made it clear, without pressuring her, that there were paths back into the world she used to inhabit, consulting roles, training positions, opportunities that would have paid considerably more than a hospital salary and asked considerably less of her patients. She chose to stay. She began, at Dr. Reyes's request, teaching a monthly trauma workshop for staff, focused entirely on catastrophic hemorrhage response, junctional wound management, and the kind of calm, disciplined thinking that panic tends to erase from people who have never been trained to hold pressure through fear. Nurses who had once whispered about her scars now sat in the front row taking notes. Dana, the nursing student who had frozen in the trauma bay, became one of her most dedicated pupils, eventually requesting to shadow her permanently. Tommy, discharged and healthy, visited the hospital gift shop with his father one afternoon, and insisted on buying Mia a small stuffed raven from the shelf, entirely unaware of the significance of his choice. She kept it on her desk in the nurse's lounge, a small private joke between herself and a life she no longer needed to hide. Priya asked her once quietly, over coffee in the break room, whether she missed her old life at all. Mia considered the question honestly before answering. "I miss the people," she said. "I do not miss needing to be someone the world required me to be every single day without rest. I like being needed here in smaller doses, on my own terms, with room left over to be an ordinary person the rest of the time." Priya nodded slowly. "That sounds like peace." "It is the only kind I ever actually wanted," Mia said. Months later, when new nurses joined the floor, they no longer heard whispers about a strange woman with unexplained scars. Instead, they heard often within their first week some version of the story that had already settled into Iron Harbor folklore. The story of the quiet nurse who once made a Navy SEAL commander stand at attention in a hospital corridor. The story of hands that could hold a wound, closed with the same steadiness they used to hold a frightened child's fingers during a bad night on the pediatric floor. Dr. Sterling transferred to a different department within the year, requesting a change of scenery that everyone quietly understood had less to do with career growth and more to do with no longer being able to walk the trauma floor without every nurse on shift remembering exactly how wrong he had been about the woman he once called replaceable. Dana, standing at the back of the trauma bay during one of Mia's later workshops, raised her hand near the end of the session. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "To whatever life you had before all this?" Mia considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things now, without rushing toward an easy answer just to fill a silence. "I think about it the way you think about an old friend you loved deeply, but could not keep living beside forever," she said. "With gratitude, not regret. That life made me who I am. This life is where I finally get to use everything it taught me, without paying the price it used to cost me to use it." Dana nodded slowly, writing nothing down, understanding somehow that this particular answer was not meant for a notebook. She simply carried it with her instead, the way people carry the things that actually change them. Dr. Sterling remained at Iron Harbor, quieter now, chastened by a formal reprimand and the particular humiliation of watching an entire floor's respect shift permanently away from him and toward the woman he had spent 14 months underestimating. He never apologized directly. Mia did not wait for one. Some debts, she had learned long ago, are paid simply by no longer needing to be owed. She kept her sleeves down sometimes, out of habit rather than shame now, and other times, especially during her trauma workshops, she rolled them up without a second thought, letting the scars show, letting them mean exactly what they meant, evidence of survival rather than something to hide. Mason completed his rehabilitation at a facility upstate, and before he transferred out, he asked Mia to visit him one final time. She found him standing, unaided, for the first time since the injury, gripping a walker but upright, his face bright with the particular pride of a man who had fought his way back to his own 2 feet. "I wanted you to see this before I left," he said. "You are the reason I am standing here at all." "You did the hard part," Mia said. "I just bought you the time to do it." "That is not nothing," Mason said. "That is everything, actually. Time is the only thing none of us can get back once it runs out. You gave me mine." Wolf, waiting by the door with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, cleared his throat loudly. "As much as I would love to stand here and cry about it, Mason, the van is idling and Bishop hates waiting." Mason rolled his eyes, but he was smiling as he said his goodbyes, and Mia watched the convoy pull away from the hospital with a feeling she had not expected to have again. A quiet, settled satisfaction that had nothing to do with medals or missions, and everything to do with a man walking out of a building on his own legs, because she had refused to let go of a wound at the exact moment it mattered most. "You never looked at me," Bishop had told her, that first rainy afternoon. "You only looked down." She did not look down anymore. On a quiet Sunday morning 3 weeks later, Mia visited a small memorial garden 2 blocks from the hospital, a place with a single granite bench and a plaque honoring local veterans, a place she had walked past 100 times without ever once stopping. She stopped this time. She sat on the bench, pulled a small black feather charm from her pocket, the one that matched the tattoo beneath her collarbone, and set it gently on the granite ledge beside a handful of other small tokens left by people who understood exactly what silence like this was for. I am not hiding anymore, she said quietly. To no one, and to everyone she had ever lost. I am just choosing where I stand. She sat there a long while, the Seattle sun breaking pale and warm through the clouds for the first time in what felt like weeks. And when she finally stood to walk back toward the hospital, her shoulders were straight, her chin was level, and her eyes, for the first time in 14 months, met every single person who passed her on the street. She was never hiding weakness. She was hiding command. The end. In this story, Mia used a real emergency technique called wound packing, combined with sustained direct pressure to control a life-threatening junctional hemorrhage, a bleed occurring where a limb meets the body, in a location too high for a standard tourniquet to be applied. She packed sterile gauze firmly and deliberately into the wound itself, holding continuous, unwavering pressure against the source of the bleeding using the heel of her hand and her full body weight, understanding that letting go too early to check the wound could undo minutes of critical progress. This technique, taught today in advanced first aid and stop the bleed courses across the country, has saved lives in combat zones, car accidents, workplace injuries, and countless ordinary emergencies where a bystander, not a soldier, happened to be the first person on the scene. The moral of this story is simple and true well beyond the world of hospitals and battlefields. Competence does not always look the way we expect it to look. The quietest person in the room may be carrying more strength, more training, and more courage than anyone realizes. And the people we are quickest to underestimate are often the ones most capable of saving us when it matters most. Anyone, with the right training, can learn to hold pressure, to stay calm under pressure, and to become exactly the kind of person a stranger needs in the worst moment of their life. Consider taking a certified first aid or stop the bleed course in your own community. You may never need it, but if you ever do, you will be very glad you learned it before the moment arrived rather than during it. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe to Silent Badges Stories, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you hardest, because there are more stories like Mia's still waiting to be told.